Global Zero is working a lot on the nuclear tensions and threats between the nuclear armed states. What are the key initiatives or possibilities that you're working on at the moment?
Well, Global Zero has a long-term plan. We believe that to make progress toward zero disarmament, that the approach has to be inclusive. It goes directly at the nuclear weapons countries and their friends and allies. And so we emphasize the importance in the next phase of this process to bring Russia and the United States back into a dialogue. I mean, I'm not sure how far you can go without their cooperation and commitment. So we're working very hard. We go to Moscow. We have access to the Kremlin, and Ambassador Pickering, who used to be the ambassador to Russia, has entree to people like Ushakov, who's the national security advisor of Russia. So we're just working that side of things very hard, because we think that it's critical to get the numbers way down, deep cuts bilaterally, and in parallel working to establish a multilateral forum to bring all the countries into the process. It's just, for half a century, it's just been Russia and the United States. We need to get them all going into this discussion, dialogue, and negotiation for Global Zero. And so, how do we sort of jumpstart the multilateral process? We think that bringing countries together to talk about risk is a good way to start, and some of the measures that might build confidence and reduce risk. So that's,
And Global Zero gave a report. In fact, you gave a presentation here on military incidents between, particularly Russia and the United States. And a lot of this information wasn't known by the delegates here. I guess it's not that well known in the public, maybe some incidents. Can you mention just a little bit about that, what the risks are that you see from military incidents and the tensions?
Yeah, well, you see there's sort of an arc of crisis around the world, really, from Europe to the Middle East, South Asia, the Korean Peninsula, the South China Sea, in which nuclear weapons countries or their allies are basically slugging it out at some level to elbow or jockey their way into a position of what they think is improved defense. But we find that there's a lot of interaction that is inadvertently escalating because of the security dilemma that these countries find themselves in, which is that they think that some provocation warrants some defensive move or reassurance of allies. But the other side looks at it as a provocation, as an offensive move, and then they react to that. So you get into an action-reaction cycle. And I think we're seeing this cycle of escalation. It's an early and fairly low level of tension, but it's real tension, and it can spiral upwards. And as crises worsen, controls and risks are affected, and for the worse, and it becomes difficult to manage these crises, and safeguards against the use of nuclear weapons are shed in the process. For example, in a really extreme crisis, you would see many more nuclear weapons deployed in the field. A crisis in South Asia would involve the assembly of nuclear weapons and their mating to airplanes and missiles and deployment into the field, and that creates additional risk of unauthorized or accidental use. So we've looked at the incidents of military encounters for the last 2 years around the world, not just in Europe, and have found that there has been a steady increase in these incidents, which reflects a steady rising level of tension involving quite a number of countries. So we're right now into the question of what we should be doing immediately about these risks. And so Global Zero is is trying to organize countries and through track 1 and track 1.5 and 2 meetings involving senior people to address these risks and the steps that could be taken to reduce them, like taking strategic missiles that are on launch ready alert off of hair trigger and sort of relaxing the fuse on U.S. and Russian strategic missiles, things like that. So we think that could be an entree into a multilateral dialogue that could then sort of morph into that dialogue on the full range of issues, including getting all these countries, nuclear weapons countries, around the table to talk about proposals for reduction and ultimate elimination of nuclear weapons.
Now, the nuclear arms states are not here at the open-ended working group, so you're bringing an appeal to the allied countries and non-nuclear countries to help support this in some way. What can they do?
Well, I think that our main audience are the nuclear weapons countries. This is Global Zero, and that's who, we have hundreds of former senior military commanders and national security officials in Global Zero, and they mostly come from the nuclear weapons countries and our close allies, and so that's the primary audience for this. But we appreciate the support of the entire international community, and the question of the likelihood of use in a crisis or the risk of use is really kind of the premise, the underlying sort of core assumption of the entire humanitarian consequences movement. It's what makes it compelling. And so it's a natural alliance, it seems to me, between countries with nuclear weapons and their allies who want to reduce the risk of their use. They should want to do that, and the humanitarian movement. We all have the same kind of interest in concern about risk.
Yeah. So the open-ended working group has been asked to make recommendations on measures to reduce nuclear risks. You mentioned a few ideas: taking nuclear weapons off alert, standing down the launch on warning policy. Are there other measures that this open-ended working group could recommend to the nuclear weapon states that a collective recommendation might help move this thinking within the nuclear armed states, particularly Russia and the United States?
Well, taking weapons off alert and achieving a consensus among all the nuclear weapons countries, some of whom have no weapons on alert normally, that they would refrain from ever putting them on alert except under special circumstances that would be regulated and require pre-notification, is a very important step. We believe that we should revive the idea of a joint early warning and risk reduction center that brings Russians, Americans, and Chinese and other countries together to monitor missile launches, address ambiguous indications of missile attack, and et cetera, et cetera. And as General Cartwright said, who was here representing Global Zero and was a senior military commander in the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, it's important to make that data available to everybody, not literally everyone, 189 countries or whatever. So that's an important step. We also are very concerned about the emerging problem of cyber attack against nuclear command control communications and early warning networks. No one knows the extent of the vulnerabilities and all of the consequences, but there are a number of really serious ones, such as the possibility that cyber attackers could corrupt early warning data and precipitate the impression that a country is under attack, which would be very dangerous in a crisis, or even get inside the launch circuits, the electronics that connect to the missiles on hair trigger alert, because they're just waiting for a short stream of computer code. And if someone could gain access to the circuits, it's conceivable that the code triggering the launch would come from an unauthorized source through cyber attack. So there are a whole range of concerns about cyber, and we would like this group and particularly the United States and Russia to advocate and lead a negotiation that would prohibit cyber interference with any nuclear command and control or early warning system anywhere in the world. So we already have an implicit norm, a tacit norm against interfering with early warning satellites, a norm that between the United States and Russia. And so there's sort of a precedent here, and we think we should push this far deeper and into the cyber arena.
Okay. There's been a lot of progress on securing fissile materials, border protection, other nuclear security aspects through the nuclear security summits, through the UN Security Council Resolution 1540, Convention on the Suppression of Acts of Nuclear Terrorism, cooperation at that level. Do you think that a similar type of leadership initiative, such as nuclear disarmament summits, could help build some of the political will, momentum, commitment and resources to work on some of these issues on the nuclear disarmament side?
Well, we're trying to organize a Track 1 roundtable that would be convened by a major country at the foreign ministry level to bring 20 to 30 countries to the table, including the nuclear weapons countries, except quite possibly not North Korea, to talk about nuclear risks and steps that could be adopted to reduce those risks. And from there, this forum could, in the future, then become a venue for more ambitious and cosmic proposals for reducing and eliminating nuclear weapons.
Okay. Now, in the opening,
let me just add that I think the nuclear security summits have had very limited benefits because they have addressed only a small fraction of one kind of material, highly enriched uranium. They've in civilian stockpiles. They've not addressed the bulk of the material, which is in military stockpiles, and nor have they really effectively addressed plutonium, both in civilian and military stockpiles. And let me just mention that when President Obama took office and launched this process, the nuclear security summits, there was enough material in the world in nuclear weapons grade uranium and plutonium to produce 200,000 Hiroshima class nuclear weapons. When Obama convened the last summit recently, there was still 200,000 equivalent nuclear weapons in the world. That's because while we've managed to blend down 10,000 weapons equivalents from highly enriched uranium to low enriched uranium and sort of got rid of those weapons in a sense, we also allowed continuing stockpiling of civilian plutonium through reprocessing to offset that. So it was a wash. We're not really making a huge amount of progress, in my opinion, on the fissile materials control front.
And part of that, though, is because there's still the fissile material for military purposes is out of the equation. If there was a nuclear disarmament summit process, would the military stockpiles be brought into the equation?
So it's key that in any sort of serious multilateral forum for nuclear weapons reduction and disarmament that fissile materials be taken into account. Because you have right now a lot of shuffling around of different categories of weapons. We talk about the dramatic decline in the number of operational strategic weapons over the years, but many of those weapons that were taken out of the operational stockpile are still in the reserve, and then there's a huge pile that's still in the queue for dismantling, and then there's a lot of material that could be reconstituted as weapons from the plutonium and secondaries of nuclear weapons that weren't destroyed. They were put in storage. So actually, there hasn't been a huge amount of progress on if you add up all the fissile materials over the last 30 years, there's still not been that much. There hasn't been that much progress.
Okay. Here in the open-ended working group, there's a lot of frustration amongst a large number of countries, particularly the non-nuclear countries, with the lack of progress on nuclear disarmament. And one of the proposals being talked about is, it's called a ban treaty. That is, countries who are now willing to come together to prohibit the possession of nuclear weapons sign a treaty. And the idea that might put pressure on the nuclear armed states to speed up or build their further commitment on nuclear disarmament. Do you think such a ban treaty would have influence on the nuclear armed states, or would be ignored by the nuclear armed states?
I think that it could change the conversation a bit. They would certainly take notice if a treaty was actually negotiated. In the meantime, there's very little resonance for this idea, and as you know, there's a lot of resistance to even get into the conversation because the nuclear weapons countries aren't here. But it's not really taken seriously as a worry. It's resisted in principle, but it doesn't strike officials in these countries, Russia, France, and the United States, as something that worries them, that they would be much affected even by a ban treaty. So it's sort of fallen on deaf ears, I would say. This process has annoyed some mid-level bureaucrats, but it hasn't worried them. And that's unfortunate. I think they should be here and having this conversation, because it's been, I think, edifying. It's been very civil and insightful, and there's a lot to be learned about the differing perspectives, and we shouldn't be closing our eyes and ears to the views on the ban. But no, I don't think the Global Zero believes that to make real progress on either the long-term agenda of elimination or the near-term agenda of risk, which is really an urgent agenda, that we have to have an inclusive approach that brings the nuclear weapons countries and their allies into the dialogue, and that without that, if there's a divide between them and the ban advocates, such as we hear very prominently here at this body, then I think it's just a dead end. I think the ban treaty would be a dead end, and I think you have to get buy-in at an early stage for something like that from the countries that are most affected, and they're not going to be, if they're left out of the process, they're not going to enter into it later on. In my opinion, I think it's just not going to work out.
And as well as like track 2 approaches, do you think like there are any of the forums, for example in the United Nations, that it can contribute to it? Is it useful to have the Conference on Disarmament, even though it hasn't done anything for 20 years, or the UN General Assembly, or another UN Security Council, the summit meeting like the one President Obama presided over? Are there some of those venues that can help in the process?
Well, I think the UN is the natural venue for this process. It's not the only one. I think everyone is frustrated by the impasse that we see in a lot of different areas, from fissile materials cut off to getting the comprehensive test ban treaty ratified, to making more progress in the reduction of nuclear weapons. That frustration should be inspiring a lot of creative, innovative ideas on how to move forward. And I think the UN is a natural place for for that to happen. But it's up to the UN to come up with the creative solutions. In the meantime, I think that we're all working to try to develop approaches that get some traction. And no one knows how to move this forward successfully right now. Mm-hmm. It's going to be, a very long-term process, and it's frustrating. But I think that people understand risk. They see the rising tensions in the world could have adverse nuclear and humanitarian consequences, and I think that there's a sense of urgency to try to do something about that, both among the nuclear weapons countries and everyone else. Mm-hmm. So I see this as a kind of risk as being kind of the fulcrum of consensus that could kind of move things forward and address the real urgent threats that we confront that could blow up the world in an hour.
Mm-hmm. The UN Secretary General, close to the start of his term, put forward a 5-point plan or proposal for nuclear disarmament. He launched it with Henry Kissinger on one side and Mohammed al-Baradei on the other. Mm-hmm. Do you think that it would be helpful for the UN Secretary General to do something similar again? Would it help having the top person from the UN putting forward some of these ideas and issues and proposals?
I think it would be helpful. I don't know if it would work, if it really would get traction. I think that unfortunately, almost all of the approaches that are being promoted, including global zeros, aren't going to succeed unless we go beyond sort of the elites and the institutions of disarmament and reach the grassroots, ordinary citizens, educate them, bring them back into the fold of concern and commitment about the nuclear risks and the need to eliminate those risks, and that means ultimately getting rid of all the weapons. So I think we're working with a serious handicap because none of us have managed to elevate this issue to sort of dinner time conversation, like we managed to do with climate change. I mean, every day there are a million conversations about climate change, right? Yeah. Every day there are a handful of conversations about nuclear weapons. So I'm afraid, we're going to have to be a lot more creative about non-institutional approaches, and I think the role of NGOs and civil society that really try to push a strategy of grassroots support and public education and really media outreach that works. That's sort of those are the indispensable pieces of the puzzle that are missing right now.
Okay, well that's a good challenge for us all to work on. Thank you very much, Bruce, for talking to us.
My pleasure. Yeah.
Thank you.